Yes, my name is Dr. Peter Brand. I'm professor of Ancient History and Egyptology at the University of Memphis and also a UTA alumni.
So, how does it feel being Indiana Jones?
I rarely get that actual experience. Archaeology, Egyptology is a lot of fun, but it's not quite like the movies. Although in many ways I find it more interesting than, running through catacombs being chased by giant rolling, rocks. But what I do is to record inscriptions in one of the large temples in Egypt. So I don't dig things up. I'm not an archaeologist. I specialize in recording ancient inscriptions and interpreting the wall carvings and the hieroglyphic texts that the Egyptians recorded on the monuments. Also, we use this to interpret ancient Egyptian history. And so the Egyptians wrote their history on the monuments. So in order to understand Egyptian history, we go and study these giant monuments with all the kinds of hieroglyphic texts and elaborate paintings or carvings that they would put on them.
What's your favorite thing that you've ever gotten to do whilst engaged in your work?
Well, I haven't had too many Indiana Jones experience, but I did have one that it's called a cache tomb. It's where they reburied some of the royal mummies. Between about 1200 and 1100 BC, there were these series of robberies where all the ancient tombs, and the priests later gathered these royal mummies that had been stripped of all their gold finery and reburied them in a secret tomb in the cliffs in western Thebes. And so they were doing a TV documentary, and the person who was supposed to do this segment on this royal cache tomb couldn't do it, so I got to do it. So it was this kind of an Indiana Jones, because I went with this guy, we went down this shaft, and, it was like 55 feet deep or something like that, and then through this long, winding tunnel. And I noticed that the walls weren't exactly smooth. It was sort of like a rough cut thing. They were kind of crumbly, and I was thinking, this is cool, as long as it doesn't collapse while we're in here. So that was my most Indiana Jones experience. But in many ways, my most enjoyable moments are actually things that you might think were, kind of dull by comparison. Is staring at these inscriptions and working with them and actually having those kind of aha moments where things crystallize and you suddenly understand more deeply what this all means. It's often hidden unless you understand the context. And there are all kinds of subtleties there. They don't tell you the lost history of Atlantis or anything. It's nothing like that. But you actually get a better understanding of how the Egyptians thought and how they designed these incredible monuments and just how clever they were.
Would you be willing to tell us more about your work with Seti I?
It's interesting, and my old professors would remember this when I was here. I was fascinated by this one particular pharaoh, Seti I. He was the father of the famous Ramesses the Great. And Seti had this incredible tomb in the Valley of the Kings. He built a lot of beautiful temples, particularly one called the Temple of Abydos. And I was fascinated by him ever since I saw this old TV documentary from National Geographic about Egypt. And it had a section about people that were studying this beautiful temple of the pharaoh Seti I. And so I became fascinated by that. And when I was an undergraduate here at the University of Texas, I did papers on Seti I and on the history and the historiography of ancient Egypt at that time. And it led literally to my PhD dissertation and also to a project recording inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak. But I got my first step here at the University of Texas at Arlington.
That's wonderful. So in terms of epigraphy, what do you think all of us should know if we're just now being introduced to the topic?
So epigraphy is this technical term that has to do with recording inscriptions that are usually carved in stone. And so as opposed to archaeology, people digging holes in the ground, epigraphists are the guys that stare at the walls of Egyptian temples and tombs that are covered with these elaborate paintings or carvings. Since the Egyptians wrote their history on the monuments, the history books are standing there there on the temples and tomb walls. And that has to be studied and recorded. Also, these inscriptions are literally several thousand years old. I mean, where I work at Karnak, the inscriptions from the time of Seti are 33 centuries old. And of course, after that much of time has passed, they're not always in the best shape. They've eroded. Sometimes the ancient Egyptians and their modern descendants invented recycling, including recycling old monumental inscriptions or blocks of stone. And so for a variety of reasons, these inscriptions are often fragmentary or they are faded. And so one of the things we do is actually trying to interpret these damaged inscriptions. Because as I say, because they wrote their history on the monuments, and because like every culture, they rewrote their history, when that happened, they literally rewrote the monuments. And so one of the things I've studied, they would erase the inscriptions, especially the names of earlier kings, and replace them with the current ruling king. And so one of the things we tried to do is to understand Egyptian history by studying how these monumental inscriptions were literally changed or altered or erased or replaced at various times in Egyptian history.
What's the most egregious example of erasure that you've encountered?
Sometimes on the column, we find as many as 5 or 6 pharaohs that added inscriptions, very often on top of each other. What they would do is they just fill it in with plaster or erase the old inscription and then carve a new one. And you have essentially a hieroglyphic word jumble of this crazy assortment of hieroglyphs carved one on top of the other. Another case of an inscription from the time of Seti and Ramesses at this temple at Abydos. And here you have the names of the pharaoh Seti carved on a ceiling beam at the top of the columns. And his son Ramesses came along and put his own name. Where you have these overlapping hieroglyphs, there's one place where people on the internet have noticed this and are convinced that they see an ancient Egyptian representation of an attack helicopter, an army attack helicopter, along with some other sort of hieroglyphic word jumbles that they're convinced are representations of submarines, hovercrafts, and a glider.
Okay.
And so it's a kind of conspiracy theory on the internet. And a lot of people want to believe that this is, this ancient civilization had advanced technology. But it all comes down to this habit of the Egyptians of reinscribing one inscription over an earlier one.
What's the significance of inscribing over the top of each other?
These monuments that they were leaving their inscriptions on are important temples. So they actually viewed the temples as almost a kind of ancient billboard where the pharaoh could essentially show off and say, look at me, look what I did. And there were some places that were quite literally like the Times Square. The Hypostyle Hall at the center of Karnak is the most prestigious venue in all of Egypt. And so you want your name to be there. And the problem is if an earlier pharaoh's name is already there, sometimes the only way you can put your name there is to put it over top of. So it's like, reusing a billboard and, just putting a new ad up. This is what these later pharaohs are doing.
Does Seti remain your favorite, or has someone usurped him?
They don't call him Ramesses the Great for nothing. And after having written my first book about the pharaoh Seti, now my most recent book is on the pharaoh Ramesses II. And it's one of those things, it was inevitable. If you go back to this documentary, I remember that it talked about Seti and it talked about, recording the inscriptions, but the centerpiece was Ramesses. And I also remember these old National Geographic magazines from the 60s talking about how they moved these temples that Ramesses had built with the gigantic statues. And it talked about Ramesses signing what they called history's first peace treaty with a rival empire. So even though Seti was what my first work was, I've been continuing, and Ramesses has overshadowed, like he did in life and in death. For Seti, Ramesses was a hard act to precede rather than to follow.
If there was one thing about Ramesses that you would want all of us to know.
Ramesses is one of those pharaohs that it's one of those, you either love him or hate him. And he's often considered to be sort of the most arrogant of pharaohs, or, sort of the ultimate braggart. He often inscribed other people's monuments with his own name. But this becomes a kind of caricature, is that you find that lurking behind this sort of grandiose facade is that he turns out to be a rather canny statesman, a very clever pharaoh, and almost the guy who invented PR and spin control. One of my favorite ancient hieroglyphic texts is this record of Ramesses. Some of the records that he wrote, of course, his famous narrative of the Battle of Kadesh, which is sort of like this brilliant piece of sort of, it's often called propaganda, and in some ways it is, but a marvelous effort in spin control. But it's also, it's high poetry, and it's very sophisticated. Another fascinating document is actually a peace treaty that he signed with this Hittite empire that ended more than 60 years of conflict. And so Ramesses and his Hittite counterpart actually brought peace to the Middle East, perhaps for the first and last time. The Egyptians and this other empire, the Hittites, had literally been at war for several decades in a long, bitter conflict over Syria, where today we literally have horrible things going on. Syria is a sad place, but it has been, it's been the battleground of empires for literally thousands of years. And what is interesting is, even though the Egyptians and the Hittites were bitter enemies, and even though somebody like the Pharaoh Ramesses, who spent the first 20 years of his reign in this desperate but unsuccessful, aggressive wars against the rival empire in Syria. And finally, despite this, he overcame this mindset and this aversion to peace and was able to make peace with his enemy. And it wasn't all, sunshine and butterflies, as they say after this. I mean, when you read these diplomatic communiques they would send back to each other, they would even argue about what happened at the Battle of Kadesh years later, and they would grumble about things.
So is there anything that you can say about the representation of ancient Egypt in popular culture that you really have to disabuse your students of? Or
Well, I mean, it's sort of the same with other ancient cultures, but when you see some of these rather horrible movies like Gods of Egypt, and the ancient Egyptian gods didn't look anything like those guys in those movies. I must admit, it's one of those things about popular culture and Egyptology is that many Egyptologists, of course, come to it and many of my students come to it because of movies, TV shows, video games. As somebody who loves video games since they were first invented, I love games that have a theme of ancient Egypt or ancient Rome, that kind of thing.
You've mentioned having a linguistic background is really beneficial if you want to pursue Egyptology. Did you struggle a great deal learning the hieroglyphs?
Is that the hardest thing about learning ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs is that you have to learn the language and grammar of the ancient Egyptian language, so when you translate those hieroglyphs, they don't translate into English. They actually translate into Egyptian, and then you have to translate the Egyptian language into English. For instance, the verb is and the verb have do not exist ancient Egyptian. And that always blows students' minds, because those are the two most common verbs we use every day, and yet the Egyptian language doesn't have them. So suddenly they find sentences and like, how did they say I am? It almost is like the old cliche about, me Tarzan, you Jane kind of thing. They say, I scribe, which means I am a scribe. And the way you say I have a house, I owner of house. There's no is. Or have. There's no I have a house or I have a dog. You just I lord of a dog or something like that. Okay. It's interesting because sometimes the cliches about Egypt are actually true, such as the cat thing. And one of the things that is almost required to be an Egyptologist is you must love cats. I have two. And of course, they are named after two pharaohs, Ramesses and Khufu. And as they said, that cats were worshipped in ancient Egypt, and the cats haven't forgotten this. It isn't just this cat goddess Bastet who personifies the cat. Even the sun god Ra could transform himself into a giant cat that would kill this demonic serpent. And, so cats are great for, killing snakes. And so the sun god himself would become a cat to kill this evil snake. And of course, the Egyptians did actually, to some extent, if you will, worship cats, not in the way we think of them. There are many thousands of cat mummies that have been discovered in ancient Egyptian temples and cemeteries. And so there's a story about a Greek who supposedly is killed by an angry Egyptian mob for, accidentally killing a cat, when in fact actually thousands of these cats were actually were killed. It's awful, but that they were killed in order to send these prayers to the gods.
So would they have been treated like we do our domestic pet?
These kind of cats that were used in the temples, not unfortunately not for those. But on the other hand, we do know that just like they did with their dogs, the Egyptians were sort of like fond pet owners. They kept cats and dogs as pets. And so we have things like tomb scenes that shows this man hunting wild birds in the marshes. And it's a little family outing. He's with his wife and children on these little boats, and he's hunting birds. And the pet cat is with them, and this cat has caught 3 birds at once. This beautiful painted scene from one of the tombs. It's now in the British Museum. And so the cats were family pets as well. They always show in art, the eyeliner with the long, sort of stripe coming out from behind the eye. But this eyeliner that they used, what it was actually made of most of the time was either sort of a kind of powderized copper or even lead. And its purpose, first and foremost, helped cure bacterial and parasitic infection. In ancient Egypt, in the Nile Valley, there were all kinds of horrible eye diseases and infections people could get. Whether they fully understood that or that was part of their thinking, I think. Oh, they knew this was effective, and yes, it was art, and yes, it was, sort of a beauty, but it also was very practical. And a lot of this was magic and medicine at the same time. They may have realized that honey, when used on a wound, is helpful. They wouldn't have understood that honey has a kind of natural antibacterial property. They didn't know what bacteria were, but they knew that honey worked. Although they also understood or believed that this was part of the power of the gods. And so even when they were using practical substances, even as something as basic as putting a bandage on a wound, you didn't just put the bandage on, you also recited a magical religious formula. And actually, invoking the gods and harnessing the power of the gods through magic was just as important as wrapping linen around a wound.
Do you have a favorite Egyptian god?
Of course, there are lots of them, but I like the goddess Sekhmet. She is this ferocious goddess. She is usually portrayed as a woman with the head of a lioness. And her name literally means the powerful one. And she was a tough goddess. You did not want to get her angry. She could be ferocious, violent, and dangerous, but she was also very powerful. And if she was on your side, then everything was going to be okay.